Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Utilities Committee. First of all, is there any request for bill introductions? I know of a couple of them. Here we go. Please state your name and who you're with. And push the button because we've been forgetting that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Claudia Hassan with Kansas Farm Bureau requesting introduction of 25 RS 0077, requiring the KCC to establish and enforce a code of conduct and ag impact mitigation protocols for large energy facilities.
Okay, any questions, committee? Okay, we'll consider that bill being introduced. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Larry Ann Brown. I'm here today representing the Americans for Affordable Clean Energy. We would request the committee introduction of a bill encouraging the private investment and free market competition of the electric vehicle charging market.
Okay, is there any questions? If not, we'll consider the bill introduced.
Thank you.
Larry. Okay, I'm excited. We got two great presentations today. So the first one that we have coming up will be an update on the Kansas Oil and Gas. Dana Reith, which is Chairman of Independent Oil and Gas Association Board Chair, is here to present. Dana, welcome to committee. So state your name and make sure that button's on up there, please.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Dana Reith, and I am the current chair of the board of the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association, and I work for Berexco in Wichita, Kansas. We're an independent oil and gas production company. And I just cannot start here with that. It's red. Should it be green? It's red. Okay. But I can't start out without a shout out to Senator Bowers because I grew up in Belleville, just north of Concordia. So I'm a farm kid at heart. Where do I punch to get it to go? I just want to take a moment again to say Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association has been around a long time. We started in 1937, and we're the lead state and national advocate for the Kansas oil and gas industry. And we are represented by Watkins Public Strategies, and Jason and Jessica, I think, are both here. Yes. And we also have some Cuyahoga members here. If you could just raise your hand briefly. We've got kind of a crew here to help me if there's bad questions. So really, I think that the message that I want to convey, a couple different messages, but one of the first and most important is that Kansas oil and gas industry, along with ag, is really foundational to western Kansas in particular, and southern Kansas, and to some extent eastern Kansas, but mostly western. And we generated about $2.4 billion of oil and gas production in 2023, $3 billion in family income, because ultimately oil and gas in western Kansas is about jobs, and it's about paying royalties to farmers. It's about oil and gas income to support the oil and gas production. Here's a quick summary of oil and gas industry taxes paid, $186 million in 2023, and that's both severance and ad valorem. And I'm probably going to talk about a little more detail today than has been done in the past when people have talked about Kansas oil and gas. I'm an engineer by trade, so we're going to talk about some numbers. Specifically, though, if you look up there, $48 million in severance, $137 million in ad valorem. And ad valorem is a real estate tax based on the value of the oil and gas production, sort of akin to your real estate tax on your house. So what are these taxes? There's 5 taxes in total: severance tax, property tax, which is property tax on equipment, and then ad valorem tax, as well as state income tax and federal. And in addition, a lot of people don't know this, a fee is charged per barrel and per MCF of gas sold to support the cost of the Kansas Corporation Commission Oil and Gas Conservation Division. So we're also paying to a significant extent to the regulatory agency through, in effect, a fee per barrel. And it's worth pointing out, renewable energy sources, they receive subsidies even before producing any electricity. We're paying both a fee per revenue dollar of severance tax, which is 4.3%, and then the real estate taxes, which tend to range between 4 to 8% of revenue, not profit, of revenue per year. And I think, gosh, if there's one takeaway from this presentation today, it's the top line of this slide. Every oil well is like a small business.
I apologize. We're in another room. I'm truly sorry. Truly sorry.
You really didn't want to hear what I had to say? So, gosh, it's a rough situation here. Anyway, every oil and gas well, we've got to have people to go tend it. We have to have people to repair it. We buy electricity, we buy services, we buy supplies. It's like a small business. And the other crucial thing is it's a primary job. It's sort of like either ag or a factory. It creates wealth in the community. It does not redistribute wealth. And I always tell a story. In Belleville, where I grew up, a local family started a really nice restaurant. Senator Bowers has heard this story. And it was a nice restaurant. Belleville has about 2,200 people in it. The restaurant could not survive because it was a secondary job. It didn't create its own wealth. It had to recirculate wealth that was already in the community. That's the key distinction between a primary job as opposed to a secondary job. And that's why in Wichita, if there's ever any threat to the aircraft factories, boy, they're all over it because they know those aircraft factory jobs create wealth in Wichita, where I live. And it is certainly also true that in western Kansas, the oil and gas revenue and jobs, along with ag, are foundations of the economy of a lot of western Kansas counties. And I put in here a couple specific numbers. These are not necessarily public at all. We're hiring right now. We pay $25.50 to start, no experience. You do have to pass a drug test. You have to be eligible to work in the United States of America, and you have to pass a little physical fitness test. But I think back, I know people that still live in Belleville, $25.50 an hour, that's a darn good job. And we still struggle to find people because it's hard to keep people in western Kansas communities. And certainly oil and gas is part of maintaining those communities with good jobs. The other thing involves schools. So I put on here, and this is not a public number, Berexco paid the Finney County Treasurer $678,585 in 2023 in real estate taxes, ad valorem taxes, which is based, just like your house, you pay a certain amount of real estate tax based on the value of the house. Likewise with oil and gas, you pay a real estate tax based on the value of the reserves. So that's one company in one county of what we paid, actual dollars. And I think Finney County is certainly not the highest oil producing county in the state. Ellis County is. Finney tends to be 5th or 6th. So it just shows you the kinds of dollars oil and gas generates in the community. But there's sort of a concern here. And it's on this slide, which is generally Kansas oil wells are pretty small these days. The average oil well statewide is about 2 barrels a day, and the average natural gas well is about 21 MCF a day. So very marginal production. And it shows excess regulation, excess cost can wipe us out in terms of a lot of these wells. And so on the next slide, boy, I think I hit the wrong button. Is there a way to take it straight to the slide? Okay, you got it. So here's something you've probably never seen before in a hearing. These are actual economics of an oil and gas well. In this case, it's just southwest of Hayes. And I just want to talk about it a little bit. This well makes 2.3 barrels a day and about 245 barrels of water a day, so fairly typical well. It generates about $4,000 a month in revenue. And you'll notice it says net revenue 83.5%. So where's the other 16.5%? That's paid to royalty owners. In this case, farmers, mineral owners, things like that. And further, you also have to pay severance tax, 4.3%, if a well is above a minimum. This well falls below that minimum. But in any event, $4,033 of revenue. But let's look at the cost, about $3,800. And you'll notice the top line is electricity. And in this case, we're paying an average over about a 24-month period, $676 a month. So if you think about it, let's say that power bills keep doing what they've been doing, which is going up, particularly in the co-ops, 5%, 6%, 7% a year sometimes. It won't take very much on that electric bill, if the oil price stays where it is, to wipe out this well's profitability. And then what do? We shut off the well. And then the co-op's revenue goes from $676 a month to zero, which then means their fixed cost gets spread out over all their other customers. And that's the bad thing about oil and gas wells reaching the end of their life, or if it's premature, is the co-ops lose the best load they have, because these wells run 24/7, 365. And it really shows the power of electric rates rising on marginal wells. It wipes us out. I want to mention also that oil and gas in Kansas is regulated by the KCC, and they really are very good at it. That's the message. I have a little bit of an advantage over some companies because we operate in 8 different states, and I see that regulatory environment. And I can tell you there's some states on that list right there that are no fun, that are just impossible to operate in. Kansas is really a very well-regulated state. And I put on here effective and pragmatic, and I think those are the right words. And that does not mean we are always happy with KCC. I can tell you of numerous examples where the KCC has done things that we didn't like. So it's not always they're doing what we like, they're just really effective. And I want to kind of give you a little way of thinking about things that may come before this committee, which is there may come a time in this session or a future session where something comes up and there's a bill proposed regarding oil and gas that says, gosh, we've got to do something about this problem, whatever it is. And there's a way legislature or legislators can really tell if this is a topic that they should really pay attention to, or if it's more of an ideological thing. And the way is to notice where the people are from that testify. If they show up from Pratt and Great Bend and Hayes and Ulysses, it's probably real. It's probably something we ought to address. On the other hand, if they're from a part of the state where there is no oil and gas, particularly in the east, then maybe it's more of an ideological thing. And we've seen that time and again. So just something to keep in mind. If there is an oil and gas topic that comes up, where are the people from that are concerned about it? And finally, I want to just talk a little bit about where I think we're headed. So this graph is a really interesting graph. It's from the Independent Oil and Gas Service, which is a commercial service that provides data on oil and gas activity in Kansas. The blue line is the oil price, and the red line is the number of drilling rigs drilling in Kansas on a monthly average. And it's really fascinating. If you look at it, you can see For most of the time frame, up until the right, those two curves tend to lay over each other. And then you can see when the inflation really hit in goods and services, particularly starting in 21, 22, 23, 24, where those two curves diverge. And why is that? It's because the cost, particularly of steel, cement, labor, and other inputs has gotten so high, it's become much more difficult to pay out the capital cost of drilling wells. And you know, we talk about inflation affecting our lives, whether we're buying milk, I won't say eggs, that's a bird flu thing, but certainly it affects everything. And the Kansas drilling activity has been fairly low lately. You can see on the curve we're at, gosh, the lowest levels we've seen in a long time, even though the oil price isn't too bad. And it's really a function of high cost. So sort of in conclusion, I think Kansas oil production and those revenue dollars that we talked about in the early slides probably be fairly consistent. So if you're thinking about from a budgetary point of view, what's going to come from oil and gas, you know, barring some particular oil price collapse, which we never know will happen, should be fairly consistent. And it sure looks like drilling activity is going to stay at a fairly low level for the next year. I hope a year from now, maybe we have higher commodity prices, but oil and gas is a lot like ag. If you have low commodity prices, you get less activity. People plant less corn if corn prices are low. But hopefully we'll at least stay at a fairly steady level. And that is what I have prepared today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dana. With regard to that low rig count that we've got, once you, because of economics, close out a rig, is it even economically feasible to reopen it, or what kind of challenges go along with that?
Yeah, your intuition's right. It's a terrible problem, both from an oil producing well. If it gets shut down, the capital costs to restart them tend to be very high, and a lot of times they just don't get restarted. But it's also true with drilling rigs, because drilling rigs are, as you can imagine, maybe you're all watching Landman, I don't know, but they're you know, it's big, heavy equipment with a lot of moving parts, a lot of engines. So those drilling rigs, if you look at that curve, that are no longer drilling, they're sitting in the back 40, and the engines are rusting away. And so what's happened is a lot of those drilling rigs won't come back either. And so it is important to at least maintain some reasonable level of drilling activity, because you sort of lose capacity.
Are you hopeful with the new change in administration that things are going to improve, or thoughts on that?
Well, that's a tough question. And let me tell you why. On the one hand, we think that there should be some reduced regulatory cost at the federal level. Particularly there's rules that have been proposed on methane emissions that are terribly worrisome. In Kansas, the oil reservoirs tend to be old and pretty depleted. There's very little methane being emitted in Kansas at all, but the cost would be very high to comply with all those regulations. So we're hoping that goes away. But on the flip side, for example, very recently, Mr. Trump at that Davos Center, he gave a presentation where he said he wanted Saudi Arabia to increase oil production. So with the left hand, if you say I want drill, baby, drill, but with the right hand, I want lower oil prices, you can't really have both in a free market. Which of those will prevail is anybody's guess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hey, we got any other questions? Senator Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for your testimony today. I'm just curious about fracking. Are we doing any fracking in our state, and is that more cost effective? Does that help with rig count?
Okay. The short answer is yes, there is some fracturing going on, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions about fracturing. So I just want to take a moment. Fracturing is a method to stimulate a well that's been drilled. Okay? Sometimes we pump acid down the well, sometimes we might fracture the well. But it's been going on since the 40s. The first frac job in the world was pumped in southwest Kansas near Ulysses in the 1940s. And there really wasn't any big hoopla over it until maybe the last what would you say, 7 to 10 years, something like that. But the reality is the way wells are constructed, we're talking about fracture stimulating a zone that might be 5,000 feet from ground surface with multiple layers of steel and cement to protect groundwater. So we view it as sort of a common thing that doesn't endanger any groundwater at all.
And does that include directional drilling too, or is that
No,
completely different?
Well, no, it's sort of tied in. So most of the wells in Kansas are vertical wells. So you drill straight down, and then at the horizon that you might have oil and gas, you punch a hole in the steel pipe, usually with shaped charges. Technology was invented in World War II. And then you might acidize or fracture those holes to allow fluid to come to the wellbore. That's the standard technology that most Cuyahoga members are producing from. What changed about 10 or 15 years ago was companies figured out how to drill horizontally. And then let's say you've got a horizontal well that's a mile long. About every 100, 200 feet, you can punch holes in that pipe and acidize or fracture stimulate. Well, it's like having 20 wells all lined up that all produce up. And that was the big change that allowed the U.S. to go from 5 million barrels a day to about 13. But there's a hangup. In Kansas, the geology isn't really right for it. The horizontal wells that were tried in Kansas were mostly economic failures. In a typical year these days, there might be less than 10 horizontal wells drilled in the entire state because the economics did not work out.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Reith, thank you for being here. You said two things that I'm hoping you might address. One was about, tax credits for oil and gas. Are those credits available on pipelines?
Well, I'm not sure, but I wasn't really talking about tax credits. I was talking about taxes that we actually pay, that we pay every year. In terms of pipelines, I think pipelines do pay some amount of real estate taxes based on the value of the pipeline. And I think the distinction I was drawing with respect to the renewable energies is those tend to not, particularly wind farms, not pay taxes for, I believe it's a 10-year window. And in Senator Bauer's district, just east of Belleville, NextEra put in a big wind turbine farm in and around some of my family's land. We don't have a turbine on our land, but I'm familiar with the documents. And they're currently paying Republic County what they call pilot fees, payment in lieu of taxes, because I believe they have a 10-year property tax exemption. And it certainly would be great if we could drill an oil well and pay no property taxes on it, or real estate taxes on that for 10 years. We're not expecting that to happen, but it would certainly be wonderful. What an advantage.
Mr. Chair, I think that that's what's available for pipelines, to have that 10-year exemption, and we can confirm that. But then the other question, when you talk about what are the rigs doing, I know that we've been working on many more abandoned oil wells, and the hope is that we can balance some of that work for those rigs with plugging wells when they're not drilling wells.
Well, and I would draw a little bit of a distinction. What I was talking about was drilling rigs that drill new wells. What you're talking about is a well servicing rig, which is a smaller rig that would service existing wells. But you're 100% correct. The Kansas Corporation Commission especially has been plugging a lot of wells in the state using some federal funds as well as a state program funded by oil and gas. It's worth mentioning that as far as I've read and talked to people, Kansas is basically one of, if not the best performing state in administering the plugging funds in terms of efficiency and just getting things done. I think some of the other states have been much slower and not nearly as effective as the KCC has in administering those plugging funds.
Committee, we have any other questions? Okay, great presentation. Thank you for coming, and
Thank you.
Thank Cuyahoga for all of you showing up today. Thank you for all what you do for Kansas. Okay, the next presentation we have is an update on rural broadband. Kathleen Moyer, Pioneer Communications, is here today. And welcome to committee, Catherine, and
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the invitation.
it's all yours.
Okay. Catherine Moyer with Pioneer Communications, headquartered in Ulysses, Kansas. We have several other members sitting back here of the Communications Coalition of Kansas, which is CCK, which is who I'm here appearing on behalf of. Just a quick story aside, I do have a dog bite on my face. For anybody that's seen me over the past couple of days, is like, what's going on with your face? My husband and I brought 7 dogs to the Lawrence Humane Society on Saturday, transporting them out of rural western Kansas, and one very stressed young puppy took it out on me. So anyway, I just, as an aside, just because I'd rather just fess up as to what happened than people wondering what's going on. But anyway, you have obviously submitted testimony. I'm not going to read it. I am going to pull out some highlights and talk about a few things. For those of you that have been on the committee for several years, you've heard some of these statistics and some of these things from me before, but hopefully we can have a conversation. I'm happy to take questions during the presentation or afterwards, completely up to you. There's a lot of acronyms in my testimony. I've got them spelled out in my testimony. I'm going to do my best to do that also verbally, so that if there's anything that I mention in acronym form that you don't catch, please ask me, and I will do my best to answer them. So the CCK, the Communications Coalition of Kansas, represents the rural local exchange carriers in Kansas. There's 34 of us. We serve all counties in the state except for Wyandotte. We serve 50% of the landmass, but only about 15% of the households. So we're serving the very rural, sparsely populated parts of Kansas. We live and work in the communities that we provide service in, and we have a vested interest in those communities doing well as our families and our neighbors. We use internally generated funds, we use borrowed funds, we use universal service funds, and we use grant funds to build these networks. For the last several years, in aggregate, our companies have spent more than $200 million in capital expenditures to build these networks in the rural parts of Kansas. And additionally, those funds, that $200 million, is augmented by grant funds that we've been applying for and receiving. What I would tell you is that the improvement in extending service and extending networks really relies on those grant funds today in today's world. The Kansas Department of Commerce, through the Kansas Office of Broadband Deployment there, KOBD for short, has administered several grant programs. They've done 4 rounds of the Broadband Acceleration Grant Program. That was the grant program that was funded through the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, the $85 million over 10 years. It is being distributed at a 50-50 grant and match formula. What I would tell you is that 50-50 grant match formula is probably going to get a little tough as we get towards the end of the bag grant rounds, just because the parts of Kansas that are left to serve are very expensive. And so even at a 50% grant, there may be some issues with trying to make a business plan to serve that. KOBD has also deployed $83.5 million of capital projects fund from the U.S. Treasury, and that was in the 22 to 23 timeframe. The Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas Committee, that you probably all remember, the SPARK Committee, committed $49.2 million to KOBD, and they also recommended another $35 million of American Rescue Plan Act money to go to KOBD to be distributed as well. And then currently today, KOBD is working to distribute the $450 million that they have received, or have not yet received, but will soon receive from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which you've all heard as referenced as BEAD. So the BEAD funding is what the KOBD is currently working through. What I would tell you is that the BEAD program application period just closed at the end of December. And so now the KOBD staff is in what they're calling sort of a quiet period, where they're working through those applications and working through what they are going to ultimately submit to NTIA for approval for those funds. There's obviously some questions. I'm sure you've all seen the news about the executive order and OMB coming out of the executive office saying that they're going to stop payment on some of these programs. Still questionable, working through to figure out whether broadband is a piece of that or not. And so that's to be determined. But what I want to do here is highlight a couple of considerations that we have when we apply for these grants. Those truly rural parts of Kansas really don't have a true business plan that works for the building of networks. You actually, you have to build it, you have to maintain it and service it and continue to upgrade it into the future. So that's an incredibly important piece of what we look at, is that piece of that business plan. And then secondly, is what is the cost that we're going to charge the consumer? Because we all know you can build something, but if you can't charge a reasonable rate to a customer, they're not going to utilize it. And so that's another piece of the formula, obviously. So as we look at that, grant opportunities, is the one-time grant enough? Is it enough to build it? Is it enough to maintain it? Is the customer revenue that's ultimately going to come from a grant-funded area that we build, is that customer revenue enough to maintain it and eventually upgrade it? So all of those things go into the formula when we take a look at whether to apply for grants. The carriers that serve the rural parts of Kansas have to be ready to invest for the long term. Oftentimes, we're looking at a 20-year rate of recovery, a return on our investment. 20 years is a really long time to let something sit and wait for that return. So the company that I work for, Pioneer, recently built 32 rural locations at a cost of $750,000. So it's $23,500 per location. So if you think about them as a customer taking a broadband package, let's say they take a little bit of a higher end broadband package and they pay $100 a month for a gigabit type of service, $100 a month is $20 years to recover just that initial investment. It doesn't recover anything else of the cost of providing the service over those 20 years, just that initial investment. So the companies that are providing the service today and the companies that have employees that live and work in these communities are vested and they want to be there and they are willing to make these 20-year investments. The other thing that we need to take into account is the ability to scale our networks. Customer adoption of higher speed packages is happening routinely, but the number of devices being connected to the internet is continuing to multiply. If you look at my house 5 years ago, we probably had 10 devices. I think when I counted the other day, we had close to 20, and it's just my husband and I. So there's a lot of devices connecting there. There's a lot of data being shoved over the internet, and the possibility, or you have to plan for the actual upgrading and the scalability of those networks so that you can supply faster and just more data in general. If they aren't scalable, that becomes a problem because you end up with congestion, you end up with you don't have the ability to put all of the data onto the network that you need to, so they must be scalable. Switching gears just a little bit, in my testimony, I reference our 2023 economic development study that we did. We partnered with Wichita State at the Center for Economic Development and Business Research. The purpose was to study just the economic landscape of Kansas, specifically as it relates to the rural companies and the impact on the urban parts of the state. My written testimony does include a reference that I included the infographics and executive summary. We didn't actually print those. So if it's something that you all want, we're happy to supply it and we can do that electronically. It's some interesting data. It's obviously slightly dated because it was in 2023. And so we're working this year to upgrade or to update that. So we will update that. We're happy to bring those results to you individually towards the end of this year or at the start of the next session. But basically, the report highlights that those of us serving the rural parts of Kansas really do have an economic impact on the urban parts of the state. And that's why it is an important statewide issue, not just an important issue for the rural parts of the state. To further illustrate a little bit of the sparseness, I'm going to give you a few facts about our service territory. We have what I will call a certificated service territory, and then we have areas outside of it. And the certificated service area is where we have some certain regulatory requirements that I'll speak to in a minute. But that area is about 5,000 square miles. In aggregate, we have about 2 customers per square mile. However, 81% of our customers live within 15 square miles. So the other 19% lives in 4,985 square miles. And so once you take that into account, once you get out of those, I'll call them population centers, our small towns, once you get outside of those areas, the density is roughly about 0.5 people per square mile. So it gets very, very, very sparsely populated. And so when we take into account about 14% of our network is utilized by the 81% of our folks living in the towns. So the 19% that live out in the very rural parts have 86% of our network. So again, just a few facts to give you the sparseness of our customers. So if you take that into account, it's obviously more expensive to serve that part of a service territory than it is to say, I would love to have an apartment building in downtown Wichita, right? I mean, the number of people in a small city block would be great, but that's not what we have. We have very sparse, large networks with a small number of customers on it. What I would tell you too is that Pioneer Service Territory looks very much like our other membership service territories. It doesn't change just because you go to talk to somebody at Next Tech or Golden Belt. Their territories look much like ours. Within those territories, we're carriers of last resort. So we have some regulatory obligations that tell us you have to serve a customer if they want voice service, no matter how expensive it is to serve that customer. So economic viability is out the window. You have to serve them. And they were really established to take care of areas where competition wasn't going to take care of them, especially when they started working through this 30, 40, 50 years ago. But in exchange for accepting those regulatory obligations, we also have access to some dollars. We have access to some Universal Service Fund dollars from the federal government, and we have access to some Kansas Universal Service Fund dollars from the state government. And that really is used to deploy and maintain and keep rates affordable for the customers in the really rural parts of Kansas. But in order to access those funds, we have to invest the money first, and then we have to bring back proof of that investment to the regulators in order to then receive some of those dollars. We simply don't get dollars and just get to spend them. We have to spend them first and then go to the regulator to ask for a portion of those. So we'll do it like anybody else does. If you look at the service territory, you talk about the technology you're going to deploy, what makes the most sense, and then you make investment decisions based on those things. Again, it's been a success. Parts of rural Kansas have been well served that are served by the CCK companies. We've done a good job of getting fiber further and further out to the very rural parts of our service territories. And ultimately, the farmers and ranchers and the folks living in those rural territories are really the recipients of us making that investment. One thing I would note, I often get asked this, is do others utilize the fiber network? And yes, we have a lot of cell phone carriers that utilize our network, because if you think about it, obviously your self call or your cell data goes to a tower and hits fiber at that point and goes onto the fiber network. And so a lot of cell phone, the T-Mobile, AT&Ts, et cetera, Verizons of the world utilize our fiber networks in rural parts of Kansas in that manner. What I would also say is that there are places that we serve outside of those places that we have regulatory requirements. So we do serve some places that we could find, again, a business plan to make viable. But normally, those include, again, pockets of population. They don't include the very rural parts of the counties in western Kansas. Again, found a business plan to utilize it and have managed to make that work. What I would also say is that I think that grant programs are going to play probably the most important part as we go into the remainder of this year into next year, and expanding the service across Kansas. So with that, I'll end my testimony, formal testimony. I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, I talked about obviously a lot of things, but there are still a lot of things associated with the technology piece that I didn't even bring up. So, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Catherine. Committee, questions? Senator Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Kat, thanks for describing my district so well.
Welcome. Thanks for serving our districts.
Yeah, I appreciate what you do and all your other members. I think Idea Tech had the contract for US 83. I think it was I-70 to somewhere south. Is there access for folks on that, or was that just a dedicated state emergency line?
So it's an interesting project in that there's a couple of different pieces to that project, but part of it was a middle mile grant program that was applied for by KDOT, actually, that received some of the dollars. And then the other part of it is a construction project that Idea Tech is constructing on behalf of KDOT. So it's a little unclear in today's world what access for us is going to look like on some of those. There are two pieces of the fiber that are in there, I'll say not two pieces of fiber, there's two distinct fiber ducts or conduit, some of it belonging to KDOT, some of it belonging to Idea Tech. My assumption is we have seen a rate card from KDOT with some illustrative rates, as to what it would look like for other carriers to access theirs. I'm assuming, I haven't had a conversation with Idea Tech, but I have in the past about other paths of utilizing their network to get to other parts of the state. So it depends which part of the program you're talking about. And again, we've seen some rate cards, but nothing yet in concrete.
I formerly represent the 122nd District, which included Hodgman County, Jetmore, and I know they looked at middle mile grants and programs, but it was too expensive. I mean, is that the one other link we ought to have in western Kansas, or are there higher priority? You know, the state didn't come down 156, but
Right.
there are communities there.
Right.
Thank you.
I would expect, and obviously that's a question for KDOT, but I would expect as they continue to roll out fiber for I believe it is at the smart driving, I don't know the name of the program, but something to do with like autonomous vehicles and things of that nature that they're really aiming for the future. I mean, I would assume that they're probably going to look at additional routes. I don't know that, but I mean, to your point, 56 is a well-traveled road, right? I mean, we utilize it often. So I would expect that at some point, some of those additional routes will get built. From just a perspective of data coming out of Western Kansas, right now, we send data as Pioneer. We send it to Kansas City, we send it south to Tulsa, we send it west to Denver. And so there are already multiple routes out of Kansas for that part of data.
Thank you, and thanks what you do for the little furry creatures, too.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any other questions? Catherine, I'll have one for you here.
Okay.
When you look at rural demographics, and I'm going to call it the 80-20 rule that you kind of described, in the last 10 years, and as you look forward, is that changing? And the reason I ask that, it seems like you go out and drive in the country compared to 30 years ago. There's a new house, there's a new house. I just wondered if that's changing at all, or do you guys track any of that kind of stuff?
So ours hasn't changed a lot. What I would tell you is that I believe it will change probably in the next 10 to 15 years with less population in the rural parts and some probably population loss. And I say that because I think that we have some older farm owners that when they decide that they're going to stop farming, there's either going to be an aggregation of some of that farmland, or their children are going to take it, or some buyer is going to take it that's probably going to use precision ag and probably not live on the farm. So while you might see some of that population shift, I'm still going to argue you still need the fiber at the farm to facilitate the precision ag piece. But what we've seen is not a large population growth in rural. And again, I'm limiting that to the far western part of the state.
A follow-up question to that, on the BEAD program, you was talking about you had to have at least 50%.
That's with the BAG program.
Yeah, okay. So as we get to the back end of this, and it's harder to cover that, do they have the ability to say, well, you put up 25%, can they play with that number?
No, KOBD does not have that. The legislature wrote very specific rules in the Ag Transportation Plan that said it's 50-50. And I think at the time, it wasn't, BEAD wasn't on the horizon. There weren't some of these other grant programs that were coming from the feds yet. And so there probably wasn't an expectation that at the end of 10 years was going to be like the really, really rural parts of Kansas, right? So they don't have the ability to do that. They would have to come back to you all to get the ability to have a sliding scale match. BEAD is a little bit different. BEAD has a bigger match portion. So when you look at maybe a $40 or $50 million project, you're probably putting up 10 to 15 as a company, and the remainder could be matched in BEAD. I say that not knowing yet what the high cost threshold is and a few other things that are still have to come out of KOBD based on the applications that were made. So there's still a lot of fuzz around BEAD as to what some of the dollars are gonna and the matches will actually look like.
Any other questions? Sure, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm hearing that was a legislative decision about the 50-50 match.
Correct.
So think about what possibilities would exist for a different match and at what time frame, it might be really helpful or helpful, feasible, expedient to ask the legislature to address that.
Will do. Thank you.
It sounds like a bill coming up.
That is what it sounds like. Much to the chagrin of everybody sitting behind me.
Is there any other questions, committee? Catherine, I'd like to tell you thank you, and thank you for the service that you all provide for Kansas.
Thank you for the service you all provide.
Great place to live. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any announcements or committee information? I don't have anything on my part. So with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.